that as far as most lacrosse fans are aware, professional lacrosse in Canada began in 1987 with the Eagle Pro Box Lacrosse League, the predecessor to the National Lacrosse League. Some people will know that pro leagues existed in 1974 and 75 and in 68 and 69. A few will know about the 1931-32 Pro League, called the International Lacrosse League, featuring the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Montreal Maroons, led by Lionel Conacher. But few know that the golden age of pro lacrosse, when the game was at its zenith, a height it has never equaled, was between about 1901 and 1911. Professionalism in Canadian lacrosse simmered for many years before coming to a boil in 1905, when the last amateur National Lacrosse Union team turned pro. The dismay, even disgust, felt by many people in amateur sports organizations had to do with the Victorian ideal, the theory of the cultured gentleman athlete, a man who played strictly for his physical, emotional, and moral well-being, not for cash. The man who played for money, in the eyes of the amateur elites, was of a much lower social class. But not every pro-caliber team or pro-level player played for money, even in the pro leagues. Next slide. Can you see that? Not very well. That's the Montreal Shamrocks. I'm sorry you can't see it. Can it be increased in the screen size, or is that it?
That's as big as we go.
Okay. All right. For example, the original pro team, the 1901-08 Montreal Shamrocks, featured a mix of paid and unpaid players. Next. A little bit better. The 1910-11 Vancouver Lacrosse Club, you see here, was composed entirely of paid players, most of them from Eastern Canada. Next. The team, owned by a colorful transplanted Australian businessman named Con Jones, cost him $40,000 a season in salaries alone. Con Jones, let's see if I can get this to work. This fellow right here. Vancouver's star attraction, Edward Newsy Lalonde, commanded $4,500 for 10 games. New slide, please. There's Lalonde from Cornwall. His team's chief rivals and Minto Cup champions, the New Westminster Salmon Bellies, considered themselves amateurs, sort of, even if the Canadian amateur athletics officials didn't. The only Salmon Belly player on the payroll in 1911 was a defenseman from Ontario named Johnny Howard. Howard's main role was to check Newsy Lalonde, and he was paid $1,500 for the season, while the rest of the team split gate receipts at the end of the year, about $300 per player. The grandson of one of those players told me that with his share of gate receipts, his grandfather was able to buy a beach property for summer vacations. But big paychecks and summer properties were the exception. Most pros earned between $25 and $50 a game. At the height of pro lacrosse in Eastern Canada, the National Lacrosse Union comprised 7 teams: Montreal Amateur Athletic Association, Montreal Nationals, Montreal Shamrocks, Toronto Lacrosse Club, Toronto Tecumseh, Ottawa Capitals, and Cornwall Colts. In the West, the British Columbia Lacrosse Association, formerly the BC Amateur Lacrosse Association, comprised 2 teams: Con Jones's Vancouver Lacrosse Club and New Westminster Salmon Bellies. Unlike Vancouver, backed by the wealthy Con Jones, the Salmon Bellies depended heavily on ticket sales to stay afloat. New slide. That's the Salmon Bellies. All of these teams, East and West, had their own field, clubhouse, and grandstands. For example, the Shamrocks played on what is now Jean Talon Market. The only trace of it is Shamrock Avenue. The Toronto Lacrosse Club played on a field that is now Rosedale Park. Next slide. Rosedale Park. The Tecumseh team, owned by the Toronto Railway Company, played at Hanlan's Point Stadium on Toronto Island. Thank you. Why, we might wonder, would a team play on an island? The reason is that the island in those days was the site of a large amusement park that attracted hordes of people in the summer. Ride the roller coaster, then catch the lacrosse game. Next slide. That's also at Hanlan's Point. Next. Okay. Vancouver practiced at Brockton Point and Stanley Park and played games at Recreation Park, a stadium at Smythe and Homer in the downtown. That's Smythe and Homer, just on the right-hand side there. You can't see it very well, it's unfortunate, but if you could see it better, you'd see this large stadium, grandstands. There's about 15,000 people at this game. This was a Minto Cup game. And those kinds of crowds weren't unusual. The population of Vancouver is about 100,000. There's maybe another 20, 30,000 in New Westminster, so there's a lot of people relative to the population overall at these games. That's how popular the sport was. The Salmon Bellies played at Queen's Park, and they're, yesterday these were clear, I'm sorry. They played at Queen's Park. You can barely see it there, but again, there's about 8,000 or 9,000 people at that game. And the accomplishments of the team are on permanent display at Gifford's Jewelry Store in downtown New Westminster. That's a storefront, and all the trophies, the team trophies are all, including the Minto Cup, are all arrayed in the storefront. Now, Thomas Gifford had 5 sons, all of whom played for the Salmon Bellies, and all 5 are in the Canadian Lacrosse Hall of Fame. Proud father, and proud of what the city had done with the team. Next, please. Lacrosse was a social ritual in the early 1900s. Here's how the Vancouver Sun described the first game of 1912, which coincided with May 24th, Victoria Day. I quote, "The opening of the lacrosse season is the supreme local event in the calendar in the way of sports, in automobiles, driving vehicles of every description, and in streetcars." The crowd journeyed to Queen's Park. All were in holiday attire, the women dressed in purest white for the most part, the men with few exceptions in straw hats. Canadian flags were everywhere. They decorated the motor cars, they were pinned on coat lapels, and they were waved riotously in the air. Next slide. That's the Grandstand at Queen's Park. It was Flower Day, too, and the fragrance of the enormous bouquets was carried through the summery air, mingling, it must be admitted, with the less pleasing odors of the invariable lacrosse game cigar. Next. The field where the Salmon Bellies played is still there, a stone's throw from the arena, where the team has played box lacrosse continuously since 1932. But until 1929, the park was the site of a large-scale annual fall event called the Royal Agricultural and Industrial Exhibition. Like the Tecumseh team at Hanlon's Point, the Salmon Bellies benefited from the hordes of people that attended the week-long exhibition. The Salmon Bellies and officials of the exhibition always scheduled a Minto Cup challenge for the annual event. The gate receipts, seats were typically 50 cents, were usually split evenly with the challenging team and helped defray the considerable cost of sending a team cross-country on a 4-day-long train trip, plus accommodation and meals. I mention money because as much as it gave rise to high-caliber teams and exciting competition, the lack of it was one of the primary causes for the downfall of early pro lacrosse, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. Lacrosse games, pro or amateur, were played June through September on Saturday afternoons at 3 o'clock. This was the tradition anywhere lacrosse was played, 3 o'clock Saturday. The reason for that was that people worked 50 or more hours a week, including half a day on Saturday, if they were lucky. And of course, Sunday was the Lord's Day, so that ruled out any day and time other than 3 o'clock Saturday. In the days prior to the First World War, lacrosse was the dominant summer sport, and people looked forward to dressing up and attending games. Next. In Vancouver and New Westminster, many people traveled to and from the games in specially constructed railway cars. I don't know if you can see, but there's about 6 or 7 cars back here, and they're open cars. They've got sort of these wooden seating so they can stack people in there. And these were special cars they had made. There were so many people traveling between the two cities that they made these special cars to accommodate everybody. But it wasn't as if the average person had a lot of choice when it came to sports entertainment. They went because it was the only game in town, so to speak. This would be another factor in pro lacrosse's downfall, and indeed in the downfall of amateur lacrosse in general. Next slide. The professionalization of lacrosse could, in many ways, be linked to the Minto Cup, first awarded to the country's champion team in 1901. A lot of prestige went with the Cup, and every team wanted some of that prestige. The Cup's first holder was the Ottawa Capitals, but by the end of the season, it was in the hands of the Montreal Shamrocks. It was a Challenge Cup, so in theory, any team could try for it at any point in the lacrosse season. Some background on the Montreal Shamrocks. When the Irish arrived in Montreal in force in the early to mid-1800s, many of them found work building a canal to bypass Montreal's Lachine Rapids. In order to be close to their work, they grouped together in the banks of the canal they were building. This area became known as Griffintown. New slide. You can kind of make it out there. In 1840, the Lachine Canal was expanded, creating more jobs and industrial opportunities, but Griffintown remained a poor and crowded working-class community. Griffintown, noted Stephen Leacock, the humorist, in his History of Montreal, this wretched area whose tumbled, shabby houses mock at the wealth of Montreal was the first of our industrial slums, the gift of the machine age. St. Anne's Church, which you can sort of see right here at the heart of the community, right in here. St. Anne's Church, built in 1854, was the spiritual heart of the community. Even the least devout attended Mass every Sunday. The Shamrocks Amateur Athletic Association was formed in 1866 and sponsored hockey and lacrosse teams. The club's lacrosse field was a large plot of land at the corner of Avenue Atwater and Rue St. Catherine in the western part of the city known as St. Louis. This was later the site of the Montreal Forum, home of the Montreal Canadiens. The area grew with the arrival of the Transcontinental Railway in 1876 and the establishment of the Mile End Station. To counteract Griffintown's abysmal social conditions, the St. Anne's Young Men's Society was founded in 1885 with a mandate to promote, quote, moral, upright living, end quote, among young Catholic Griffintown men. To this end, a three-story building, St. Anne's Hall, was erected in Griffintown. It featured a library, a bowling alley, and a concert hall to accommodate glee clubs, drama, and debating societies. The society was also involved in religious and social functions, including the annual St. Patrick's Day Parade. On a St. Patrick's Day weekend, people came from all over Montreal to the Monument National on St. Lawrence to watch the society's plays. The St. Anne's Men's Society excelled at sports. Most of the players on the Shamrock lacrosse team were part of this society. But alongside the Catholic Church and its morality, Griffintown had in excess of 100 bars, including the legendary Joe Beef's Canteen on the Griffintown waterfront. For Shamrocks fans, however, the most popular establishment was the Tansy House Tavern, owned by a member of the Shamrock Lacrosse Club's executive. On Saturday game days, it was a scene of not only heavy drinking, but also heavy betting. And I quote, in July 1881, notes John Matthew Barlow in the House of the Irish, upwards of $15,000 changed hands at the Tansy House alone on a Montreal Shamrock match. Griffintown, according to Barlow, reached its peak between 1868 and 1885. By the turn of the 20th century, the Irish-Canadian population of Griffintown was greatly reduced. Upwardly mobile Irish Catholics were assimilating into the population of Greater Montreal. In 1867, the National Lacrosse Union was founded. In 1885, challenge play was replaced with league play. Teams in this league were the Montreal Amateur Athletic Association, also known as the Winged Wheels, later became the Detroit logo for the Detroit Red Wings, Toronto Lacrosse Club, Toronto Ontario's, and the Shamrocks. The neighborhood surrounding the Shamrocks grounds grew again when the Montreal Street Railway converted from horse car lines to electric cars in 1892. This gave Griffintown Shamrocks fans easier access to the games, but it was not a good thing so far as the Shamrocks middle and upper class management was concerned. They were trying to distance themselves and the team from its working class origins. So in 1892, the club purchased land beyond the city's northern limits in an area that today houses Jean Talon Market. Being beyond city limits and the reach of streetcar routes would make this location nearly impossible for working class people to attend matches. But the move backfired, according to Barlow, when the club realized that it, quote, depended upon the Griffintowners' patronage to make money. To correct the problem, the club used its political influence to have the Montreal Streetcar Company run a route from Griffintown to the Shamrock grounds on Saturday game days. Next slide. There's the Shamrock Clubhouse. The club erected a large, handsome three-story brick clubhouse at the entrance to the grounds. Next slide. That is the clubhouse you just saw on the last slide. That's the part of it that looks onto the field here, to give you a sense of scale and proportion. A covered grandstand capable of seating 4,000 spectators ran along the north side of the property. 2 uncovered stands occupied both ends of the south side of the grounds, and the entire field was ringed by a fence, high enough in theory to prevent free viewing. The Shamrocks defeated all challengers for the Minto Cup until 1905. In 1906, the Shamrocks finished in last place in the NLU, and Ottawa defeated the Tecumsehs in a 2-game final series to claim the Minto Cup. Quote, "It was a fine gladiatorial exhibition," wrote the Montreal Gazette about the second game. And there are some, hold it. It was a fine gladiatorial exhibition, wrote the Montreal Gazette about the second game. And there are some spots in that field where a crimson-dyed turf marks the spot where some hero fell, a martyr to his enthusiasm, end quote. 8,000 people attended the July 22nd, 1907 match at the Shamrocks grounds. Gate receipts totaled $4,000, the most, noted the Gazette, that the Shamrocks had ever taken. Among the 8,000 people were 24 priests in the Shamrock Clubhouse. An older lady, also in the clubhouse, was too excited to watch the match and was overheard saying, quote, "The Shamrocks should win. Look at the clergy that are here. God is on our side." The Shamrocks that season won back the Minto Cup, so I guess God was on their side. Next slide, please. The New Westminster Salmon Bellies finally captured the cup in 1908. There's the Salmon Bellies at Hanlon's Point, which we saw earlier, the Grand, you can see the roller coaster in the background. They took the cup from the Shamrocks. Next slide, please. This is the Salmon Bellies on their way back to New Westminster, and they've got the Minto Cup in front of them, and you can see some of their wives, in the coach behind them and everything. 1908. The New Westminster Salmon Bellies, they captured the cup in 1908. They would defeat all comers, and there were many, until losing the cup to Con Jones's Vancouver Lacrosse Club team in 1911. Next slide. That's the team that dethroned the Salmon Bellies for 1 year. Let's talk about that year a little bit. The year 1911 is the high water mark for lacrosse. Next slide, please. In Vancouver, which we see here, that's the West End, the population reached 120,000, double what it had been 5 years earlier, but the city was only 25 years old and in transition. The Kitsilano people still occupied their land at the entrance to False Creek. Hundreds of squatter shacks dotted the shoreline of Burrard Inlet, and the harbor featured a mix of masted sailing schooners and steamships. Horse-drawn carriages, heavily outnumbered automobiles. Streets were littered with dung. Dark green wooden electric streetcars, known as rattlers, crisscrossed the city. In many neighborhoods, wood planked sidewalks were the rule. Women wore large feathered hats, pouter pigeon blouses, ankle-length skirts, and carried parasols. Men wore vested wool suits, detachable hard collars with ties, carried pocket watches, and wore straw boaters or bowler hats on their heads. Next slide, please. Crowds of up to 15,000 took in what was billed as a 10-game Minto Cup series between New Westminster and Vancouver in 1911, you see here. Next slide, please. Each of the 10 games was a battle to the death, and at one point Vancouver held a 5-3 lead. Next 3 slides, just slow. This is one of the games in progress here. That's another. Okay, next slide. And next one. Next slide, yeah. So, the Salmon Bellies, in all-out effort, managed to tie the series at 5 games apiece, but lost the 2-game total goals playoff. This here is a Vancouver Lacrosse Club player. Harry Griffiths is his name, and he's at, you can see Recreation Park, and he's carrying the Vancouver Lacrosse Club flag. 15,000 people witnessed. Griffiths ran a sporting goods store in Vancouver. Many Salmon Bellies put off retirement in order to win back the Cup in 1912. That same year, the Cornwall Colts challenged New Westminster for the Cup, but lost and became the last Eastern team to try to win it. New Westminster held off Vancouver until 1920, when the club won it one last time before the Sambellies snatched it back the following year. By that point, pro lacrosse was already dead in the East. The pro game, never healthy after the First World War, finally died in BC following the 1924 season. Next slide, please. That's the Sambellies that won the Minto. Next slide. That is the 1924 Sambellies. The Minto Cup after this season was shelved in New Westminster, and the Mann Cup, next slide, first awarded to the top amateur team in 1910, took precedence from there on. So what killed pro lacrosse and hurt the amateur game as well? There are a number of factors. Fewer working hours, more leisure time and better transportation options allowed people to travel more freely on weekends, cutting into attendance at Saturday afternoon lacrosse games. Baseball, an easier game to play, rose in popularity, eroding support for lacrosse. Next slide, please. And the game did itself no favors by treating on-field violence and spectator hooliganism too lightly, and by failing to modernize the sport to make it more exciting for spectators. I don't know if you can see in here, but this is 1912 game at Hanlon's Point. It's actually between the Toronto team and the Montreal Nationals, and there's about 6 or 7 police officers on the field. Somebody is down on the field. But these were not the only factors. Professional lacrosse was beholden to no governing body, and senior amateur lacrosse was not much better directed. On top of that, there were few rules governing the Minto Cup, other than that teams were allowed to challenge for it. Administration of the Cup was overseen by a small group of trustees. These trustees arbitrated any disputes, but they had no real power and were ignored with impunity. A shrinking fan base and meager gate receipts meant that teams could not afford to travel cross-country to compete. So once the Minto Cup arrived in BC, it stayed in BC. Many of the same problems plagued amateur field lacrosse, and in response, the Canadian Lacrosse Association officially adopted box lacrosse following the final Mann Cup series on grass in 1931. That final Mann Cup series, interestingly, was played at Queen's Park between Brampton and New Westminster. After an attempt at professional, and it was won by Brampton. After an attempt at professional box lacrosse in 1931-32, there would not be another shot at it in Canada until 1968, when the Salmon Bellies defeated the Detroit Olympics for the championship. Next slide. That is the 1968 Salmon Bellies. If you could see the color, the bright red jerseys, which in those black and white photos, you'd see the exact same bright red color from 1910. Over the last 100 years, other pro sports have stolen lacrosse's spotlight, but for a brief time in the early years of the last century, lacrosse was king. Last slide. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. Go ahead and plague me with your incessant questions. Come on, what's your question? Think of something, okay. You've got a question. You're absolutely right. You're right. A lot of.
My way of thinking, that's why this game isn't bigger.
Yeah, the amateur, professional, the travel costs, almost everything I talk about, the issues still exist, don't they? Yeah.
Particularly the violence.
Oh yeah, I know. Yeah, that's funny.
You identify the owner of the Toronto Tecumsehs as a railway company?
Yeah. Over there, the streetcar. They were called the Toronto Railway Company. It was a streetcar company. I think the connection was that they wanted volume. They wanted people on the streetcar lines, and they owned the team.
Do you know the owners of all the other clubs, all the professional clubs? Is that identifiable?
Well, the Salmon Bellies were they were community owned. They weren't owned by anybody, and they're still not owned by anybody. The Toronto, the Rosedale team, the Toronto, I don't know about that ownership. I don't know that they were owned by anybody. The Shamrocks, they had quite a strong executive, but I think they were probably owned by the sports, the Shamrock Sporting, the larger entity. I don't know that they were privately owned. I'm trying to think who else. I can't say, I don't know about some of the other teams. I don't know, just what I say, it's worth doing some research on. Anybody got any questions about my beloved, I'm from New Westminster, so I tried to talk fairly about the Shamrocks and how it was so bad, too bad that they lost in 1908, but I don't actually feel that. I feel good about that. Yeah.
How recognizable would the lacrosse of the 1910s be compared to what we see in field lacrosse today?
That's a very good question. I think it would be quite different. Well, first thing that comes to mind is, of course, you got a large grass field, and you've got the conditions you'd have out there. But the sticks were the rule was that you couldn't have a pocket in the stick. So they couldn't have. They wouldn't have run that much with the ball. I don't think they would have been more of a passing. There's a lot of passing going on because the ball you'd sort of like catch it and pass it almost, because there'd be no pocket for it. And they wore very little in the way of padding, very, very little, including gloves. By 1911, I think a lot of people they started wearing gloves and there's a little bit more padding, but yeah, it was, the padding was a big difference. There's some film of it. The only film I've ever seen, there's a film of 1911. About 1 minute worth of film, and playing at exhibition or at Recreation Park, and it's the Sandbellies versus Vancouver, and it's fascinating to watch. It's recognizably lacrosse. It's very rapid moving. The ball gets passed around very quickly. They swarm around the goal just like they do now. It's different, but not that different. Yeah. No questions about the Sandbellies? Come on, one question about the Sandbellies. So, does everybody know how they got their name?
Let's go with that.
Can I go with that? Thank you. Okay, then I'll get down. Okay. So the Salmon Bellies, New Westminster was a salmon canning city. They had 10 or 12 salmon canning facilities, but the sockeye ran up the Fraser River, and it's 4-year cycles, right? And so it was sort of the sockeye salmon city. It was known for that, but you get deeper into it, their uniforms were this bright red color. And the salmon belly at that time was not considered, it was something that, it was a racial thing. It was something that native peoples ate, but not white people. And so when you put these factors together, the fans of opposing teams would yell insults. They'd all insult each other like crazy, but the Vancouver fans started to call the team with the bright red jerseys Salmon Bellies, because I think when the salmon spawn, they have these bright red bellies as they spawn, right? So the people made the connection between the salmon belly and the red, and it was an undesirable part of the salmon. So they were basically insulting them, saying, "You damn salmon bellies, you worthless scum," basically. And by the way, the bright red jersey was chosen because it's the same color as the British Royal Engineers who founded New Westminster in 1859. They have the British red jerseys, so the team took the bright red color, but the fans weren't thinking, you lovely British Royal Engineers. They took it as spawning salmon. So the team, the team got started in 1889, and by around 1900, they'd been insulted so many times as salmon bellies, they started to like it. You know how a really tall guy is called Shorty, and he starts to think he's Shorty, right? So the same thing, they started to like the nickname. They couldn't get rid of it, so they couldn't fight it, so they accepted it, and they started referring to themselves as salmon bellies, and the newspaper started referring to them as salmon bellies, and it stuck. Now, some of the other teams, like the Vancouver team and the Victoria team, they were known as, the epithet that was hurled at them, they were known as crab eaters and things like this. You crab eaters. And it didn't stick, but it stuck with the salmon bellies because it was kind of true. New Westminster was on the Fraser River. The salmon did spawn. They did go up the river to spawn. There were fish canneries there. So it fit and it stuck, and it struck the players as being true. Yeah, we are salmon bellies. So it's arguably the most enduring name and logo. It's right up there with the New York Yankees, really, or the Dodgers, or some of the Los Angeles Dodgers, who, by the way, they got their name from being trolley dodgers. When they were in Brooklyn, people would have to jump over the railway tracks to get to the games, and they were called the Brooklyn Trolley Dodgers, and they became the Dodgers. So the salmon bellies, something in the 150th anniversary of lacrosse that we're celebrating, something to celebrate that we've got one of the great teams playing continuously since 1889 with one of the great logos, one of the great names. It's a real strong piece of Canadiana, I think. Now I'll get down off my soapbox. Oh, you thought of something. Excellent.
Why the green floor? Is there a story behind that at the home arena?
Oh, the green floor, yeah. For those that don't know, and I think maybe a lot of you do know, but one of the unique features of Queen's Park Arena, it was built in 1929, they have a wooden floor over the concrete. Well, one time it was sand, I guess, but over the concrete floor. And they've had that floor since 1935, I believe, or 36. And the original floor was in place from 36 till 2005. It was used every summer. And it's this sort of parquet wooden floor in sections that they would put on into the rink when it was lacrosse season. And so the original floor lasted a long, long time. And when it finally outlived its use, they put a new wooden floor in. And I think it's the only one in, there might be one other one, but I think it's about the only one in Canada. Most teams play on either a kind of a cement surface or on a modified padding kind of surface like they have in the NLL. But the wood provides a lot of, it's like a drum almost. You can hear the players running on the floor, from quite a good distance. I think a lot of the players like it because there's a little more cushioning, it's not as hard as, say, concrete. And the green color, that's a good question. I can't answer, but I think it's probably going to have something to do with the fact of the white ball and the green. They need some kind of a color. I guess they could have chosen red, but they chose green. Maybe because it's like grass, honestly. It sounds, the players are used to playing on grass. What color are we going to make the floor? Let's make it green. I'm speculating, but I bet you it's probably something like that. And the green makes sense because you could see the ball against it, right? Grass, green. Yes?
I showed a little way to already answer this, but how has the contact changed in terms of back when they were playing with significantly less gear? Is it comparable to kind of how fields play today? Or
The contact?
yeah.
Ooh.
Was it more?
Well,
a lot of slashing in the field?
there was a lot of slashing. The sticks were, I don't want to overemphasize this, but I've read a lot of newspaper reports of hundreds and hundreds of games. There were a lot of very clean games where the teams just played lacrosse, but the stick was really used as a kind of a weapon. They didn't wear any kind of helmets or anything, and they didn't feel much compunction about swinging sticks at each other's heads, and I mean like a full chop. If somebody had made them angry, a player, he'd go after that guy with a stick. And then the kind of penalties they got were sort of, somebody could be knocked unconscious with a stick, and he'd get like a 15-minute penalty. It wasn't like he'd be banned from league play for, 3 years or something. So it was kind of accepted that every once in a while a guy might get angry and take a swing. Well, that's lacrosse, I'm not saying it was condoned or anything like that, and there were lots of referees who were former players back in the 1910 era who really hated it, and they were very vocal about how they hated it and how they thought it was a real detriment to lacrosse to play that way. But it was kind of tolerated. In terms of in terms of, say, checking, I don't think that the checking was probably, as you say, was probably a lot of stick kind of checking like that, hacking at hands and wrists, and if you got angry, maybe swinging at a guy's head. I'm not sure about the body contact part of it. In box lacrosse, when I remember it, as I remember it in the 60s and 70s and even 80s, there was, the confined space, there was a lot of body checking, say like in hockey. There's less of that now over the last 20 or 25 years, I find anyway, the less of that checking. It's unusual to see it, partly because of the sticks are lighter and they're different material, they're not wood. So, you check somebody, you're going to bend this thing or break it or something. So it's kind of back to the stick checking. I will say, though, that I'll tell you a little anecdote about, it wasn't just the way the players played, sort of hacking and slashing at each other. There was a fair bit of that. Occasionally, the spectators would get involved. One of the most infamous incidents was in Westminster in 1922. There were literally thousands of people, and there was some kind of an incident on the field. Vancouver was playing New Westminster. They hated each other. They're the only two teams in the league. They just went at each other like crazy. They literally hated each other. And in 1922, there was an incident on the field. Some players were fighting. There was fist fighting. There was a fair bit of that. And for some reason, the fans came out of the stands, and Vancouver and New Westminster fans squared off, and the fans were on the field. And I don't mean like a few. I mean hundreds of fans, including women, were on the field throwing punches at each other at this game. And it's reported in the paper that there were little boys were running around the field between all the fighting adults, picking up things like pocket watches and wallets and running off with it, as well as stealing the equipment like the sticks and things. They were just picking the stuff off and running off with this stuff because the adults were so busy fighting. So the police loud-hailed everybody, said, you've got to stop, we're reading the riot act, you guys, stop this right now. Well, they didn't stop. This fight continued for about 20 minutes. And it was hundreds of people. And the police finally, they called the fire department. The fire department arrived and loudly threatened to turn on the hoses and hose everybody down if they didn't stop fighting. There's no indication of why this happened. It was just after the First World War. There was all this carnage in the Flanders. And then a few years later, in 1922, they're killing each other on the field. So the fire department warning calmed everybody down. And you'd think after something like that, there'd be police and arrests and the game would be canceled and everybody'd go home. And no, all the people went back into the stands, took their seats. They had to scrounge around to find sticks for the players to finish the game. Players got the sticks, they restarted the game, and they finished the game. There were no arrests, there was no follow-up, nobody got in trouble. That was it. Just lacrosse.
I talked to a guy that played in the 30s, and the lacrosse seemed to have this atmosphere because he lived in Shelburne, and they had a rivalry with Orangeville. And after one game, both teams were in the hotel, and the one team's looking over at the top score of the other team, and they decided that they had enough of this guy. They took him outside and broke both his legs. The lacrosse seemed to have this thing going in those days,
Yeah. I haven't heard that story, but that doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise. I mean, we looked at Newsy Lalonde. We're on this subject. Maybe I shouldn't be talking about this on the 150th anniversary, but Newsy Lalonde was like the infamous bad boy of Canadian lacrosse. He was a really tough player, you'd say, if you're being fair. But he had a penchant for taking the butt end of his stick and slamming it into people's mouths. There's no mouth guards or anything. I don't know how many reports I read of Newsy breaking people's teeth, and like one New Westminster player lost 5 teeth, one Newsy hit, and the fellow he knocked 5 teeth out. His name was Gifford. That's the 5 Gifford boys. They're all in the Hall of Fame. They used to just they used to key on, they never broke his legs or anything, but they would just key on Newsy. Johnny Howard, who was a Montreal Shamrock originally, used to check Newsy because he was really good at it. He was very, very hard to contain, Newsy Lalonde. He was a leading scorer. He was very, very tough, very, very rough. And the Salmon Bellies, he was public enemy number one. They were always, and there was one, I'll tell you one other quick thing. Jimmy Gifford was a defenseman for the Salmon Bellies, one of the 5 brothers. There was a game where he and Newsy, as usual, almost every game they'd fight each other. And first they'd swing sticks at each other's heads, like just going at, and then they'd drop the sticks, and then they'd start fist fighting. And finally they'd wrestle each other to the ground at this one time, and they're on the ground at Queen's Park in the grass, and they're wrestling, scrapping on the grass. And finally some Vancouver players grab Newsy's, by the ankles, and the Salmon Bellies players grab Jimmy Gifford by the ankles, and they're trying to part them, right? There's only one problem. Jimmy Gifford had hold of Newsy's ears and was dragging Newsy by the ears. They finally separated them. And so flash forward to 1966, the first induction ceremony was held for the Canadian Lacrosse Hall of Fame. Both Newsy and Jimmy Gifford were going in as charter members of the Hall of Fame. Jimmy Gifford learned that Newsy was being inducted and said, "I'm not going." He wouldn't have anything to do with it. Even 60 years after the fact, "I'm not going to the induction." So he sent his son, who happened to be the mayor of New Westminster. That's how much the animosity stuck around. Thank you.